All right, I am delighted to turn it over to our presenter tonight. Andrew Newman is a professor of English at Stony Brook University in New York. With support from a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, he's currently writing A Nation of Readers: Lessons from the High School Canon Era, a history of the teaching and learning of the books that have been assigned to generations of students. Welcome, Dr. Newman.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Hope everyone can see it now. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to present this research to Humanities Texas, especially because it's supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and especially to Humanities Texas because you do such amazing work in providing professional development to teachers, and it's not necessarily the focus of all the state affiliates. So I think these teacher institutes are really special, and I'm honored to participate in one. Okay. So thank you for all the
Drew,
participants.
sorry to
Thanks for,
interrupt you. We do
yeah.
see your comments and presenter view, so I'm not sure if you
Oh,
want
okay.
to
I'm going to
adjust that.
stop that. I'm glad I didn't say anything obnoxious, I think. But let me share my other desktop. Okay. That's better, right? Share the wrong desktop. I've got two monitors up. So, as I was saying, thanks so much for coming to hear this presentation, and thanks for when you registered for sharing your hopes and challenges, your expectations of the presentation. I read them all, and then I had a machine read them. I fed them to Voyant. It's an app called See Through Your Text, and I'll have a link to it later in the presentation or to any other resources that I use. So this is a word cloud generated from your hopes and challenges. And what I got from them was that many of you are challenged in making Gatsby relevant to your students, and your hope correspondingly is for more ideas and ways and resources to make it relevant to your students. Some of you mentioned that your students have difficulty with the vocabulary and language in The Great Gatsby, and I hear that a lot. I wish I had a solution, but I do feel like there are some other ways in that we'll talk about. Uh, and some of you also mentioned that you hope to learn more about the historical context for The Great Gatsby, about F. Scott Fitzgerald and the 1920s. And I just have to say, I'm not that guy. I'm not going to be talking too much about the 1920s, and it's not my area of expertise. I'm not a modernist. So I don't teach The Great Gatsby at the college level, usually. I've done it a couple times in a specific context. Uh, my interest is in the historical context, not for the author of The Great Gatsby, but for its many readers over generations. So the material I'm going to be presenting to you tonight has more to do with those subsequent decades in which The Great Gatsby was read, and less to do with its original context of production and publication. So my agenda for this presentation, I'm going to begin with some polling. I'm going to poll you, and then talk about another poll that I conducted with my collaborator, John Perla, who's also on this call. And then I'm going to turn to this historical overview of the pedagogical reception of The Great Gatsby, thinking about it as a book that's passed through so many hands figuratively over so long. And then I'm going to turn to some resources that I developed for this presentation. Possibly we'll have time for breakouts, probably not. And then we'll turn to the Q&A. One of the other things that you mentioned in your hopes and challenges was that you hope to learn from one another. And I don't want to waste the amazing human resources in this room. So I hope to learn from you as well. Okay, so I'm going to launch the first poll if I can. Okay, so we've got 95% participated. I'm going to end the poll and hopefully share the results out if you don't see them. Can you see the results? I didn't read The Great Gatsby in high school myself, but that 60% isn't surprising to me. And the can't remember, the 1 out of 20 who couldn't remember whether they read it, that's not surprising to me either. I often, ask former high school students what they read in school, and mostly they can't remember. Uh, but it's also the case sometimes that they, have read it so many times they don't remember where they first read it, which makes sense as well. So some of you who, the 12 who responded yes, you did read it. Would any of you be willing to share your memory or your experience of reading it in high school? Anything that comes to mind?
I
Okay,
don't
so I don't
remember
see
a
a hand.
whole lot of the teaching of The Great Gatsby when I was in high school. It was a very long time ago for me, but
Mhm.
I do remember that I fell in love with Fitzgerald so much that I read other books of his. So
So you fell in love with his writing, with his
yeah, his
style.
writing style.
Yeah, I remember that too. When I was a kid, I didn't read The Great Gatsby, but my father gave me a collection of Fitzgerald stories, and I don't remember any of them very well. I just remember like the comment that, Fitzgerald could write badly. How does anyone remember how it goes? He could write a bad story, but he couldn't write it badly, something like that. And
Yeah.
yeah, really stuck in my head. Okay, next.
Can we put responses in the chat too, if anyone's feeling camera shy?
Please.
Um, is it okay to still answer the question?
Sure.
Or um, I read it in high school, and for me, reading it, I was a poor Black girl reading about these characters who are wealthy and complaining about their lives, and I didn't like it. Um, I just didn't understand. Um, I ended up being an English major and then appreciating it later for Fitzgerald's style in writing. But as far as the story, I just did not like the story. But I read it again, not in my 20s, but in my 30s, and I took something else from it. The love part, um, it doesn't matter the race during in my
Mhm.
30s. I didn't focus so much on that. I focused more on the relationships, and how we feel. Doesn't matter if we're wealthy or poor, but yet we still have these same feelings. Um, so that's what allowed me to grow to like it now, to appreciate it and love it. So for me, reading in
Mm.
high school was a bit different.
Thank you, Jaquetta. Do I say it right, Jaquetta?
Jaquetta,
Jaquetta? Okay.
yes,
Um, was there any book that you read in high school, like in that same, maybe, was this the 11th grade American literature class when you
yes,
read it, do you think? Yeah. Was there
yes. It
any
was
book that you read where you
my
thought
eighth,
like, wow, this really resonates for me?
um, a different author.
Yeah.
I got more from Dickens,
Hmm.
um, than any. I'm trying to think. Um, I mean, I couldn't even relate to Huckleberry Finn, honestly. I mean,
Mm.
um, So a lot of the books that I read in high school, I had to go back as an adult and read in a different
Mhm.
have a different perspective than a poor high school, black girl who's,
Mhm.
in a horrible situation at home and being homeless at one point and also being dyslexic and not knowing until college. I mean, yeah, so it was very different for me to
Yeah.
understand Great Gatsby or even Dickens. And Dickens is like one of my favorite authors right now.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think if The Great Gatsby is like, keeping company with all of these other canonical works, there a lot of students would feel alienated by the whole set, right?
right,
Not just Gatsby.
right.
So with this poll, I'm a little surprised that only one of you is teaching it as a required text, because we do see it required in a lot of schools. So does anyone else have any observations about this poll results or explanations? All right, one more. Just gonna wait another moment. We're at 77% participation. Okay, I'm gonna share the results. So I was kind of hoping there would be more haters in the group, but I would really love to hear from somebody who's like, let's say six and under on that spectrum. So closer to the Valley of Ashes. Uh, why did you give it that low rating or lower rating? Conversely, those who find it like to be a great classroom text, why?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, if you get that mic problem fixed, we'd love to hear what you're going to say, and otherwise we'll check in the chat to see any responses to that last question. So Dr. Perillo and I, John Perillo is at the University of Texas, El Paso. We did an online survey of teachers and got a big boost from Humanities Texas, actually. So we got close to 200 responses from Texas, about 1,250 responses altogether. And one of the questions we asked was about, which books they were assigning in a class that they chose to report on. So that's the results from 2024, but the 1963, 1989, and 2009, those are from surveys conducted by earlier scholars. And you can see sort of the rise of the Great Gatsby in the curriculum here. In 1963, it was taught in under 5% of public schools. It was actually taught then in 17% of independent schools. And if you think about it, independent schools had more flexibility with text selections, but also their teachers largely are coming from a different background, not necessarily, through schools of education and getting certification and so on. So they might represent a little bit more of a college curriculum. But by 1989, it was in the high school top 10, the 10 most commonly assigned works. And this was a survey that was conducted by Arthur Appleby, who's kind of just a prolific scholar of education from that era. And he characterized the dynamic in the change in the high school canon as one of stability and change, which is to say things mostly remain the same, but there's some shuffling of titles over time. So we can see that in 2009 and to 2024, where most of the works, at least like 7 of the works in the top 10 in 2024 were also top 10 in 1989. But there's some slight changes, like with the rise of the Crucible and Fahrenheit 451. And by now, Gatsby is the second most commonly assigned book in high school English and the most commonly assigned novel, certainly the most commonly assigned American novel. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. So I'm going to switch media in a moment and turn to this timeline. As I indicated, I'm less interested in the original context for publication of The Great Gatsby and the sort of the Jazz Age history, and more interested in what came later. It's another way of saying that for me, the most interesting thing about The Great Gatsby isn't the book itself, but rather the people, the millions and millions of student readers who read it over many generations. I made this timeline, a version of this timeline a few years ago, in conjunction with an article that I wrote and that's shared in the Google Classroom called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, The Great Gatsby in the 1980s. The premise of that article is that the 1980s were kind of like a recurrence of the 1920s with Reaganomics and at least the beginnings of increasing disparities of wealth. So I wanted to think about how The Great Gatsby was taught during the era of that early reality TV show, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, which some of you may remember. I updated the timeline for this presentation and also to pair it with an article that I have coming out on April 10th called Gatsby at 100, American Classrooms, American Dreams. And that's going to be appearing in this online journal called Public Books. April 10th is the centenary, the 100th anniversary of the original publication date of The Great Gatsby on April 10, 1925. So I'm going to click here, and there's a link to the timeline as well in the resources that I'm going to share. There we go. This timeline is constructed using a tool, I'll have a link to that as well, called Timeline.jl, which is produced by this Night Lab at Northwestern University. And I mean, I think it looks pretty good, but it's actually very easy to do. The back end of this is just a Google spreadsheet, which is populated with all sort of the information and links that gets displayed by the timeline tool. So I've used it in class as well. I've had my students make timelines where they each fill out a row in the spreadsheet, and it works really well. It's fun. As I say on this slide, and hope you can all read it, is it legible enough? Okay, got a thumbs up. Okay, well, I'm going to proceed and hope that you can see it. If not, you'll let me know. I could maybe make it bigger. But as I suggest here, instead of thinking about The Great Gatsby as a sort of a cultural artifact of the 1920s. We can think about it as a book that's like come down through the ages. I've made this point already a couple of times. So since this year is the centenary of Gatsby's publication, there's a lot of articles coming out. I think that mine is going to be the only one to really sort of focus on the teaching of the Great Gatsby. Most of the others talk about its early publication history, its critical reception, the reviews it received in 1925, its sort of mixed reviews, and then F. Scott Fitzgerald's waning popularity, his death as a failure, and then his critical revival in the 1940s and 50s. That's kind of the usual literary history or reception history of the Great Gatsby. And this timeline has a different focus. But you can see from this one review that appeared in the New York Herald, it was considered really sort of like jazz age ephemera. Pretty great book, but it's going to disappear. No one was pointing towards an eventual centenary celebration. As far as I could find, this is the first notice that educators took of the Great Gatsby. This was a book notice that was published in English Journal, the Journal of Practice for Teachers, NCT journal, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. So this was published in 1926. And this reviewer, an anonymous reviewer, just like didn't see anything in it. I'm not sure why he wrote about it at all, but he characterized The Great Gatsby as a fair piece of journalistic writing that piles up unnecessary proof of the crassness and moral dishonesty of the upper crust and arrives exactly nowhere. It's interesting to me how his description of the plot of Gatsby sounds kind of like high school. Two young people belong. They have money and social standing, and an outsider recklessly, desperately storms the social barriers. So it's relatable, but he didn't see any future for The Great Gatsby as a teaching text, or he or she, the reviewer at the time. So this is the part that more traditional literary histories focus on, its disappearance during the Depression, Fitzgerald's death, and the epitaph on his tombstone from The Great Gatsby. Thought he was a failure, and then his revival beginning in the 40s that was fueled by these armed services editions. So a lot of service people read The Great Gatsby. It came out in a 25-cent paperback. A lot of people read it that way too. And we can think about some of these soldiers then reading it during the war and coming home, maybe through the GI Bill, going to college and eventually becoming teachers. But it wouldn't have happened as a canonical text if it hadn't gone through this critical reappraisal. This is an edition from 1953, or the title page of the edition of 3 novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald, with a very famous introduction by Malcolm Cowley, in which he describes The Great Gatsby as a compendious fable of the 1920s that will survive as a legend for other times. And it keeps getting written about in those terms after this. So both Fitzgerald and all of his works, and especially The Great Gatsby, were suddenly being recognized as this amazing American literature. And again, this is really mostly at the college level and among high literary culture, but it was positioning The Great Gatsby to become a masterpiece taught in schools. And perhaps discerning this possibility, Scribner's slapped the label Students Edition on some of their 1953 paperbacks. There's nothing in it that's indicating that it's a student's edition. I mean, no teaching materials, no study guide or discussion questions or anything like that. But they were clearly pointing towards a new market. This is from my copy of the 1953 Students Edition, which I was very disappointed to find didn't have any of those materials when I ordered it, but it did have annotations from a past user. Here the user wrote, "The unattainable," next to this description of Daisy. So some of the early references to The Great Gatsby in teaching articles in an English journal. This is one of the first from 1954, and it represents a phase, a long phase in the teaching of literature that was called life adjustment or life adjustment pedagogy, where the goal was really to help students develop, sort of like healthy psyches. Mental hygiene was one of the recurrent phrases. So literature was just used to teach life lessons in a very reductive way. And here, the author of Literature for Social Development says of Gatsby, he really can only be a negative role model for kids. He's unable to find stability of reward in a surrounding of material luxury. Like his creator, both Fitzgerald and Gatsby are poor role models. So there's not a whole lot of use for The Great Gatsby within this framework. But there is, in new criticism, or the sort of formalism that was then getting taught a lot in college English departments, almost exclusively in college English departments, and also in some schools. It happens that the author of this article on levels of teaching and testing was working at an independent school. So again, a different, probably a pretty different approach to pedagogy. And he's writing an article where he suggests that more advanced students should be able to focus more on close reading and interpretive questions instead of kind of the use of literature for social development. So he lays out a kind of list of questions for these relatively advanced students. And as you'll notice, he misspells or just mischaracterizes the name of the doctor, Dr. Esslinger, the optometrist. So in 1961, when Gatsby was still getting taught in only a small number of public schools, but was increasing in private schools, Scribner's came out with a whole school edition with all of the apparatus of a school edition, the introduction, the foreword to the student, the reader's guide and discussion questions and so on. And it was composed by the chair at Pelham High School, which is a public school in Westchester County in New York. His name was Albert Rideout. And what's interesting about it is how much it engages with the student and the student's perspective, and really even suggests to the students that they could disagree with Nick and disagree with Fitzgerald about Gatsby being so great. It's a book about people whose contributions to society seem very slight, he wrote, and is a book about people who have much of importance to say to you. 1966, Gatsby was recognized as an emergent canonical title through the production of an edition of Cliff's Notes. And Cliff's Notes, I don't know if you've looked at them lately or looked at some of the early ones, they're really emphatic in saying, like, don't read these notes unless you're also going to read the text. They're supposed to be supplements and not replacements for the text, but they're all written by college instructors, and they're very clearly espousing a kind of a formal new critical approach to reading. So that's what this Cliff's Notes does. It's not about the student, it's really, or the student's perspective, it's all about the text itself. And that was one of the keys to The Great Gatsby's rise in the curriculum, was that it lent itself so well to this kind of formal analysis as opposed to social messaging. At the same time, the 11th grade course in American literature was becoming more and more ubiquitous. So, these conditions were just ideal for the proliferation of Gatsby as a canonical text. It fit perfectly within that American literature, timeline, kind of bookending. Well, even like when you read The Great Gatsby and it has these references to Benjamin Franklin at the end and the colonial era. So it fits right in as kind of a culmination of the American literature curriculum at that period. But the prevalent approach to teaching Gatsby, first the keynote and the criticism of Gatsby, and then the way it was taught over and over again, was as a commentary on the American dream. Here in a 1970 article for English Journal, Roger Pearson, who was a college professor, wrote that it revealed the false premises for the American dream, which he characterized as a nightmare. The American dream is in reality a nightmare, he concluded the article. But at this time in 1970, that was maybe less the case than it was at any time since, in the sense that there was a high proportion of union membership. The tax rate was favorable towards the middle class. And more people were able to achieve at least a version of the American dream at that time, maybe than at any time since, as wealth disparity kept increasing from that point. With the 1970s, with all of the economic crisis of the 1970s, and then culminating with the Ronald Reagan's, the famous debate with Jimmy Carter when he says, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" That was sort of like signaling this move to a new economy and a new era. This wasn't the first Gatsby film. It was actually the third in 1974, the one starring Robert Redford and Mia Farrow. Teachers in English Journal complained about it. They said that in one article, at least, that it was a total distraction, and bringing the film into the class made it impossible to teach Gatsby. All the students could talk about was Robert Redford and Mia Farrow. During the 1980s, this one lesson plan I looked to suggested that students could think about the TV shows Dallas and Dynasty as a frame of reference for the glittering veneer and rotten core of the unspeakably rich. So a typical prompt from that area would be to, through Gatsby, compare the 1980s with the 1920s. In the 1990s, during the period of multiculturalism, the move was to pair Gatsby with other texts, essentially to make it part of a mosaic or quilt. And I contrast that with the thinking about the canon and diversification in the 2000s, as we'll talk about in a little bit. This NCTE volume, published in 2006, Searching for the American Dream, it just sort of demonstrates how this American Dream framework is continuing for really all of the decades in which Gatsby was taught. So in 2008, a New York Times reporter visited two different schools in Boston. One was the Boston Latin School, and the other was called the Fenway School, and did a report on the teaching and learning of the Great Gatsby in these schools. It's interesting because this was also for me, the year of the financial crisis, of the Great Recession. So it was very much focusing on how students related Gatsby to their own dreams, which has been my interest in my research as well. So for my research for this public books article, I interviewed several of the people who were also interested in that article. I talked to 2 former students and one of the teachers, and they were great interviews. They were really fascinating. One of the students, the student who said my green light is Harvard, was a student named Jinzhao Wang at the Boston Latin School, and she ended up going on to Harvard and actually making quite a financial success of herself. But she's very reflective about what the Great Gatsby had meant to her at that time, and about the sort of the dreams of her youth. As an adult right now, she's going to go back and reread The Great Gatsby, she told me. But she actually tied The Great Gatsby to her whole family story as an immigrant from China, and the difficulties that her parents had, coming over from China, and going back to the difficulties that her family had in China as well. The other student I talked to was a student from the Fenway School. His name was Hakeem Steed, and he feels like he's achieved the American dream, in the sense that he, has financial security, but he grew up in the projects, and when he read in Boston, and when he read The Great Gatsby at the time, he was looking at, unpaid bills and, you know, uh, um, sort of the possibility of losing his home and that kind of thing. So he really identified as somebody with Gatsby as somebody who grew up very poor, and was aspiring for something better. He connected Gatsby to his hero Jay-Z, who ends up getting tied to Gatsby quite a lot, especially because of the 2013 film, which we'll look at in a moment. In 2012, Alan Krueger, who is the chairman of the White House, the Obama White House's Council of Economic Advisors, gave a speech to the Center for American Progress in which he introduced a concept called the Great Gatsby Curve. Maybe some of you have heard of it. The idea of the Great Gatsby Curve is that it's about the correlation between income distribution and income mobility. And that's the chart that you see over here. This is from the Obama White House Tumblr, and for some reason it's still available and still works. The idea is that the further apart the rungs on the ladder of opportunity, the more difficult it is to achieve the American dream, to establish your kids in a better financial situation than the one that you were born in. So the greater the income disparity, the less the income mobility. And one of the things that Krueger said in his speech was, it's not since the 1920s have we seen such great income disparity. So my interest is kind of in tracking, what the American dream means to different students from different vantage points in history and geography, and therefore what the Great Gatsby might mean to them in these different contexts. So if the 1974 film was distracting for students, the 2013 film by Baz Luhrmann might be, all the more so. And I'm going to refer to this GIF later on as well. I do have this question of whether the glass that he's holding is a martini or a glass of champagne. I looked up some old champagne glasses and I saw some like it, but it's often referred to as a martini. But in any case, this film, which really, I think, lands really heavily on the idea of the 1920s and Gatsby as a big party, to my mind, makes it more difficult to teach Gatsby as a kind of a cautionary tale. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. So this is a book by Audrey Fish and Susan Chanel that is one of their source books that are really aligned with the Common Core. They talk about the Great Gatsby curve in this. They reference Krueger's speech. But the idea here is about teaching Gatsby with informational texts, and I think it's a kind of a common framework today, which is partly what, part why I included it in the timeline. And I have a lesson that I'll share with you that does something like this. So this is what I had in mind in thinking about 1990s multiculturalism with reference to the Great Gatsby. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Disrupt Text Teachers Collective. This is all available online too. But the slow chat that they ran in 2018 is much less about like pairing Gatsby with other texts and much more about like just getting rid of it, replacing it altogether. And I think they make some strong arguments. A few years ago, Gatsby entered the public domain, and now the text is just available everywhere online, which it wasn't before. So that enabled all of these authors to finally publish their kind of spin-offs of The Great Gatsby, so the characters could tell their own stories. And then this is the Norton Critical Edition, so it no longer belonged to Scribner's. Here's another lesson from 2022 that maybe some of you have seen it, published by Common Lit, that pairs The Great Gatsby. One of the supplemental texts is this article from The Onion with a headline, "Wealthy Teen Nearly Experiences Consequences." And the chart in the background, I think it's from Pew, but it's just showing how these levels of income disparity are reaching 1920s levels again, or are basically there, especially for non-white or families of people of color, who are much less likely to have inherited wealth. Okay, and so here we are today with The Great Gatsby as now the most frequently assigned novel in American schools. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. These were some of the teachers that I spoke with for the article in Public Books. Again, it's going to be published on April 10, and we'll share it with you when it is. I spoke to maybe a dozen different teachers and former students for the article. One of them was Eileen Sigmund at Bryan High School in Omaha. She teaches at a Title I school. And she told me that the thing that she struggles most with Gatsby is the extreme wealth, the unimaginable wealth of some of the characters. And she said her students also struggle with the language. They find it not very accessible. And so she stopped teaching it as a whole book, whole class read. She uses it for literature circles as a choice text, along with books like Of Mice and Men, which is more accessible. And
Drew, real quick, sorry.
yes.
Melissa pointed this out, but your timeline is covering your PowerPoint right now.
Oh, okay. Let me just quit it.
That just made it big again. There we go.
Okay.
Yes.
You see it now?
Perfect.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa. Okay, so Eileen Sigmund, as I said, she's now teaching it as a choice text and working in some other more accessible texts for her students. She also told me that it's just getting harder and harder to get her students to pay attention to reading in general. She uses the 2013 Baz Luhrmann film as a teaching aid. And she says last time she did that, she brought it in and she kept having to tell her students to get off their little screens to pay attention to the big screen. So it's hard for me to even imagine, like, it's such a attention-hogging film, but it wasn't enough to hold the students' attention. I spoke to Nathan Murrill, who teaches at Axel High School in Texas near Waco. And he told me that he also teaches it in sort of an American Dream unit, or that's the theme, the emphasis when he teaches it. But a lot of his students feel like the American Dream is almost dead. I heard variations on this a lot from the teachers that I talked to. Murrill is very mindful about the sort of professional, career implications of teaching literature in general. He felt like he's equipping the students with language and critical thinking skills. He's a football coach, and he talked a lot about getting them to practice these skills, in order to, be able to get jobs and maybe like go against the current, to reference Gatsby and actually, be able to realize their dreams, but they're pessimistic. Brian Hartwig teaches at what I call in the article West Egg High School. Its real name is Great Neck North High School. So it's actually, the setting for The Great Gatsby. One of his students, his current students, actually lives in the house where the Fitzgeralds wrote the book, or where the Fitzgeralds lived when Scott started writing the book. So at Great Neck North High School, the students feel a kind of ownership of Gatsby. They look forward to the unit as a rite of passage. Can't wait to read it. But they also associate it like mostly with that meme. That's all they know about it. The Great Gatsby congratulations meme. And so he's like sort of excited to disillusion them, for them to realize that, you know, they think they're going into the book as like a mirror, but it's not a flattering mirror, and they, you know, and they have to learn to recognize that. So it was really interesting talking to him about his experience teaching the Great Gatsby in that setting. Nisha Terry Young is now my colleague at Stony Brook in the English education program, but she used to be a high school teacher, and her most recent teaching experience was at the Metz Charter School in Jersey City. So she worked with mostly very poor kids, mostly Black and Hispanic. A lot of the Black kids were Muslim. And, you know, and so they had a very specific experience reading Gatsby. They talked a lot about its religious implications, like, you know, the fixation of George Wilson on the eyes of, you know, of Dr. Eckelberg, for example. But they also very much related to this idea of not just the American dream, but the Gatsby looking longingly across the water, because they lived, you know, right across the water from New York City and the glitz and glamour of New York, as Nisha told me. Well, the American dream, she's quoting her students here, sort of paraphrasing what they said. Only some people are allowed to even have the dream, right? Only some people. Others are awake. Any questions to this point about any of the slides or the teachers' contexts? Okay, so now I'm going to give you just a quick tour of some resources that I prepared to share with you before we turn to Q&A, which I'm very much looking forward to. So here I'm going to link again this is to the website that I've been developing along with my book project. So it's a link to the timeline, and I'm anticipating developing a kind of a whole Gatsby curriculum, but so far it's 2 different lesson plans. I'm just going to give you a tour of them. I'm starting with the 3rd lesson, which is about the Great Gatsby and the Great Gatsby curve. The premise of this lesson is that it's interdisciplinary, and therefore you know, prompting the students to relate the literary text with an informational text, where there's already an intrinsic relation. So the informational text is the Kruger's 2012 speech on the rise and consequences of inequality, in which he introduces the concept of the Great Gatsby curve. And the literary text, of course, is the Great Gatsby. For students who know some math, they might even, or, you know, economics, then might even be able to bring in another discipline to bear, but they don't need that kind of knowledge. Some guiding questions. And then, so there's a lot of explanation here about how the Great Gatsby curve, you know, represents this relationship between income inequality and income mobility. And it kind of gives a little specificity and data to the idea of the American dream. There's your teaks. But what I'm hoping to get the students to do is to do a kind of a collaborative annotation and analysis of the informational text of an excerpt from Kruger's speech. And there's some guidance for doing that. And then to write something where they're cross-referencing the two, the Gatsby and the speech, The Rise and Consequences of Inequality. Also, as a college instructor, I think a lot about AI, and it's, you know, now sort of like pending threat to, you know, teaching in the humanities. So I wanted to take this question, how does the Great Gatsby illustrate the principle of the Great Gatsby curve, and feed it to ChatGPT. So you can click on it and you'll see ChatGPT's response. I thought it was pretty good, but it also illustrates, the way AI works, as opposed to the way I hope we can get our students to write. So for the assessment portion, asking, it's basically an exercise that I do a lot with my own students in college, which is not to write an essay, but instead to sort of think within the framework of a hypothetical essay. So I might give them a title, and we can kind of do an outline of the evidence we would talk about in that essay, but I'm not expecting them to write the whole thing. Instead, I want them to write a body paragraph. And I think a real distinction between the way, the kind of result you get from AI, from ChatGPT or other tools, and what we can get our students to do is to ask the students to do more inductive analysis instead of deductive. So it's instead of how does this novel illustrate this principle, it's kind of take the evidence from the novel, from a specific passage, analyze it, and see what you come up with. So this is what I describe as sort of building the paragraph from the bottom up, or from the inside out, instead of like starting with a thesis and then coming up with a claim and then finding evidence to support the claim. It's I include a link. Actually, this isn't the one. I'm going to have to change the link. I include a link to this heuristic that I use, which maybe you use as well, called ACE, Assert, Cite, Explain, as for the components of the paragraph. So here's the worksheet. All right, I'm gonna have to share this in a sec. Let's see. Here we go. So what I would want the students to do is to first locate that, first to choose an essay title, and they can come up with their own, and then choose some evidence that would fit within that title or correspond to it, and then analyze it, just to make notes of analysis. So they start with the analysis and then they develop their assertion, and then they write a paragraph according to that this rubric. Okay, I have to fix a link, sorry. So here's the other lesson. And this, I think, can be useful for more visual learners or multimedia. Here, the idea is that when you're reading a novel from the 1920s, the text always remains the same, or from any historical era, but the paratexts keep changing. The paratexts are everything like that are outside the the body of the novel itself, before the sentence, in my younger and more vulnerable years. Might be the table of contents, the foreword, might be the study questions, and afterward, and it's also, of course, the book covers. So Gatsby stays the same, but the covers change through time, and there's been a lot of exhibits that are showing all of the different covers of The Great Gatsby. In this lesson, and I'm going to switch off the sec so we can get some Q&A, but in this lesson, I asked the students, like, first to analyze a book cover as a historical artifact. I love this one from the 1945 New Directions edition. But there's a worksheet so that they can do an analysis of the cover and the way that it kind of presents the text to the reader. What does the cover teach them about the era, or how does the cover choose to sell the novel to student readers and other readers? And then I have them make their own book cover that's going to do all of those same things. So here's a template, and they'll have imagery on the front cover, and some sort of text. Maybe it's author biography, maybe it's blurbs, maybe it's trigger warnings. whatever they think is important to put on the back cover in order to inform the reader. Okay. So I'll include this PowerPoint presentation with some links fixed on in the Google Classroom to share that with you. I have in this appendix, I have images of all of the book covers that I've included in that lesson in case you want to work with any of them. There's a lot of others that are available online as well. And I'd love to hear from you. If you try out any of these lessons or have other related ideas, please get in touch. I'm going to now stop sharing and let's talk. So I welcome any questions or comments. I'm going to take a look in the chat. Melissa Rankin asked in the chat whether the Great Gatsby curve is still relevant today. I mean, the concept is over 10 years old. Has anyone updated it with new data? I mean, there is new data, from economists showing that wealth disparity is continuing to increase, and I think it's surpassed the 1920s today. But one of the questions that I ask in the analysis of that informational text, the Kruger speech, is like, what kind of policy implications does this Great Gatsby curve have? Which could be a touchy question.
Professor Newman, you said that you teach this to, I think I heard you say you teach freshmen, college freshmen. Is that accurate?
Well, I teach all levels from freshmen to doctoral students.
And this is still a text that you teach to them?
The Great Gatsby, I've only taught once at college, and it was in a course on the high school canon.
Okay.
So,
I was going to ask you how you approach it, like how you just get going, but okay, I wasn't sure if I heard that correctly. Okay.
Well, my suggestion about the work with the covers is that it would be really good, like pre-reading exercise. Actually, like I think it could be split in two, and that's what I suggest there. Like, to start out writing about book covers, and in terms of like how they shape your expectations of the book you're about to read, or how they did for other historical readers in different periods. And then once you're done reading the book, you might create your own book cover.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I really love that opening activity. I'm going to definitely use that.
Thank you. And let me know when you do. I would love to hear from you about how you teach the Great Gatsby. If any of you have found strategies that work, especially for that question of how you make it relevant to your students.
Can I add some? I've taught it quite a bit at the college level. Actually, as a text for my students who are preparing to become high school teachers, to do a number of things to practice things, partly because it's short, partly because it wears its symbolism on its sleeve, so we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about the things that one might notice about it in terms of literary techniques. And one thing I find growing up or working with students who grew up in Texas is like looking at a map of New York is super helpful because I think the East Egg, West Egg beginning is like not terribly inviting to people who don't know that geography. And certainly my students here in El Paso don't. And so I just put that out there as a way of like one of the first things we do is look at a map and just imagine this place and its proximity to the city um, and just prepare them for the sort of geography of the text.
You know, I grew up in Queens, so not so far from the Valley of Ashes, really. Even though it didn't exist as such anymore, that coal dump or whatever it was. But I mean, nobody talks about the eggs that I ever knew. It's not like, it's not like a thing out there where everyone's like, going over to, gonna take the ferry to West Egg. Um, but I knew Great Neck. And now since I work on Long Island and I take the Long Island Railroad, yeah, I'm familiar with those, with those difficult to get to peninsulas, and the Great Neck and the Port Washington. But I think otherwise it's a very mystifying geography. Yeah, but I think the challenge that I'm hearing from the teachers that I talk to more is not so much like, understanding the geography as like relating to that, that huge disparity between, the lives of the characters, that extreme wealth, and the vantage points of the students themselves and, whatever school district they're in. There's very few that relate to, either of the eggs, whether it's like incredible new money or old money. Yeah. At the same time, some of the teachers that I talked to just felt like that those divisions of class, like to some degree, like map onto every classroom that they've ever taught in. There's always class divisions that are represented in the student body, and in that way, Gatsby is relatable for for all the students of any socioeconomic standing. Yeah, some of the new teachers who, or those of you who said you hadn't taught Gatsby yet, how's it coming about that you're going to be teaching it now? Is it just that you're taking on a course that you haven't taught before? So Cheryl wrote, not a new teacher, but I teach it in relation to an example of the modernism era in American literature. So, I mean, I wonder about how your students relate to the kind of historical information that you teach along with The Great Gatsby. Are they still interested in the 1920s and the Jazz Age? Do you think it would work for them to teach about, to think about their own historical periods instead of the 1920s? Or, if their parents read The Great Gatsby, what it might have meant to them when they were in school?
We just teach a timeline of American literature. So we start out with like the Puritanism era and go all the way through to postmodernism. And sometimes we choose novels, short stories, we embed nonfiction and stuff in with that to kind of do like a cross reference. But I like to keep the timeline of American literature in reference to what we're teaching to kind of give kids that.
You muted yourself, Cheryl, for the last
Yeah,
bit.
just at the
Can't
last
believe
part
I
you
did
said.
that. I was saying I like to teach junior English on a timeline of historical context so that, we start with Puritanism and then we end with postmodernism. So we kind of start with like the Crucible and the Puritanism era all the way into then teaching Fahrenheit 451 with Ray Bradbury and postmodernism contemporary. I think it gives students a purpose with American literature to understand the different forms of writing as it progresses across the different eras. I like to kind of keep it that way versus just doing a bunch of random writing samples with literature picked from here and there. So
It sounds like you cover a lot of material.
Yeah, we have in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, that's impressive. What are other contexts in which you teach The Great Gatsby? Anyone? Well, do you invite your students to relate it to the, I guess to their own prospects for the future? Do your students think about the American dream as they're reading Gatsby and what it means to them? Wendy, I see you nodding.
We just finished it, and one of the things that they talked about was the American dream. I teach at a Catholic girls' school right now, and we have these core values, these core Catholic values that we're supposed to include in our curriculum. And so it was interesting having them connect the core values of the Catholic school to the American dream to see how they matched up, and then also ask them, what's your American dream and how does that match up with Gatsby and all that stuff? So yeah, it was an interesting conversation about American dream.
But Gatsby, I mean, the novel exhibits a lot of I'd say non-Catholic values.
Exactly.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, what do you think of as sort of the gist of your teaching of it for those students? What's their takeaway?
It was very thought-provoking. I mean, they just had a lot of personal opinions about, who was good, who was bad, who they liked, and who they were like, and who they wanted to be, if they could pick a character and those kinds of things. So it just kind of gave them something to think about and feel about.
I saw a comment in here, thinking about who they liked or didn't. One of the teachers I spoke to, kept saying that their students felt like the only real moral character in the novel, ultimately, the only innocent character was George Wilson, who's a murderer, he's the only one for these students who actually sort of came out all right in the end. And I saw another comment in here talking about Wilson's suicide being problematic. And I've actually been hearing that about other books too, about these sort of canonical suicide books, obviously Romeo and Juliet, The Great Gatsby, Melissa, I see you nodding, of mice and men, sort of, at least euthanasia. There's a lot of that in the canon, and it's strange to account for how that came to be, why all of these books are taught so prevalently. But have others of you had difficulty with that aspect of The Great Gatsby?
And we'll have this be our last question as we prepare to wrap up.
I will say I was nodding because I think the whole issue of mental health in general and how that is reflected in the literature we read is much more sensitive now than it was 20 years ago. That we have to be careful about how we talk about it and what it reflects. And I can't be as cavalier about talking about the despair that the characters feel because the level of despair my students feel is much more intense. Does that make sense? And so I just think that you have to be kind of careful with how you talk about a lot of things. I mean, I think that's true of a lot of things, but I do think the whole I think it's interesting to look at George's mental health. But I also think it's interesting to look at Daisy and how she can just blithely live with what she's done and move on and ignore it. And so anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's true at all levels that we have to, be more careful in in addressing these difficult texts with our students. Yeah.
There's some really great comments in the chat, and to be mindful of time, we're going to upload this chat as well as the recording so that y'all can continue the conversation as well on Google Classroom. Just in case you're like, oh, I'm not gonna have time to read all this.
Well,
So,
and
oh, go ahead.
yeah, well, thank you all so much, and please get in touch if you have any questions about the materials or work with them. I would love suggestions as to how to improve them.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Newman, and to all of you for joining us this evening ahead of the birthday on April 10th. And hopefully, even if you're not teaching The Great Gatsby, mentioning that, historic birthday to your students, I think would be a pretty interesting thing to open a class with. So all materials from today will be in Google Classroom. So check back there in the next day or so for updated materials too. And if you were late or your coworker wasn't able to make it and you're worried that you can't repeat the past, why, of course you can. We've recorded tonight's webinar and it will be available for you shortly. And as a special bonus for all of you, Bethany is going to be dropping in the chat our upcoming institutes page, which you will see goes beyond the spring. You are getting a free newsletter blast preview and access to apply at your heart's content to our programs and share with your friends. So we hope to see you this summer in person. We'll be announcing more in the future. And lastly, we would love your feedback on tonight. And we have our evaluation link provided, and contact us with any questions. And as Dr. Newman said, you're welcome to reach out to him if you want to continue the conversation from tonight. Thank you again to all of you for all that you do. And, go drink a martini or champagne. And cheers to y'all. Have a
Cold
great
fried
evening.
chicken too. Yeah.
Yeah. Good night, everyone.